At the Christmas dinner table, when Dad declared I wasn't worthy of a single penny of inheritance, the entire family laughed and dismissed me as just the failure daughter. But only minutes later, the phone in my nephew's hand would turn everything completely upside down. The same people who had spent years treating me like an outsider were about to discover that their disappointment had been quietly building an empire worth more than they could ever imagine. My name is Rachel Monroe, and I should have known this Christmas dinner would be a battlefield the moment I pulled into the circular driveway of my family's estate in Cincinnati. The imposing Tudor-style mansion loomed against the December sky, its windows glowing with warm light that felt anything but welcoming. At 36, I'd learned to read the signs of an impending family-gathering disaster, and tonight had all the markings of a particularly brutal one. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 7:30 p.m. as I stepped inside, carrying a modest bottle of wine that I knew would be silently judged against the expensive vintages my brothers always brought. The familiar scent of my mother's roast beef and the sound of forced laughter drifted from the dining room, where the Monroe family Christmas tradition was already in full swing. Rachel, my mother, Evelyn Monroe, appeared in the hallway wearing her best pearl necklace and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You made it." We were beginning to wonder. The subtle dig wasn't lost on me. I was exactly on time. But in the Monroe household, being punctual when you're expected to be impressive was its own form of failure. I followed her into the dining room where the rest of the family had already assembled around the mahogany table that could seat 12, but felt suffocating with just 8 of us. My father, Robert Monroe, sat at the head like the patriarch he'd always believed himself to be. At 68, he still commanded attention with his silver hair and the kind of presence that came from 40 years of running Monroe Enterprises, the construction company that had built half of Cincinnati's commercial district. "There's our tech girl," he announced as I entered, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for discussing my career somewhere between amusement and disappointment. "Still playing with computers, I see." My brothers flanked him like lieutenants in an army I'd never been invited to join. Christopher, the eldest at 42, sat with his wife Sarah and their twin daughters, both wearing designer dresses that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. He'd taken over the construction side of the family business and never let anyone forget it. Daniel, 39, managed the restaurant chain Dad had expanded into over the past decade. His wife Jennifer sat beside him, perpetually scrolling through her phone while their teenage son Matthew picked at his food with the bored expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "Sorry I'm late," I said, taking my designated seat, the one closest to the kitchen, furthest from Dad's throne. It was a seating arrangement that had been established years ago and never questioned. "You're not late, dear," Mom said, already moving to serve me. "You're just exactly on time, as always." Another subtle dig wrapped in maternal kindness. In the Monroe family, fashionably late was a sign of importance. Being punctual meant you had nowhere more important to be. I settled into my chair and looked around the table. The dining room hadn't changed since my childhood, the same crystal chandelier casting warm light over the same china pattern Mom had inherited from her mother. The only difference was me. While everyone else had grown into their roles in the family hierarchy, I'd somehow remained perpetually displaced, the piece that never quite fit the puzzle Dad had envisioned for his legacy. Christopher was already deep into a story about landing a major contract for a new shopping complex downtown. "The commission alone will cover the girls' college tuition," he said, cutting his meat with the satisfaction of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Mom cooed, refilling his wine glass. "And Daniel, how are the restaurants doing?" 3 new locations opening next quarter," Daniel reported dutifully. "Dad's thinking of franchising the concept statewide." I sipped my wine and listened to the familiar rhythm of family dinner conversation, a carefully choreographed performance where everyone knew their lines except me. I was the audience, not the star, and certainly not the understudy. My simple black sweater and jeans stood out starkly against Sarah's silk blouse and Jennifer's cashmere cardigan. Even my nephew Matthew, at 20, was wearing a button-down shirt that probably cost more than my entire outfit. "And what about you, Rachel?" Dad's voice cut through my observations. "Still doing that computer thing." The way he said computer thing made it sound like I was playing video games in my basement rather than running a company. "Biomedical technology," I corrected gently, though I knew it wouldn't matter. "AI applications in healthcare." "Ah, yes," Christopher chimed in with a smirk. "Still trying to cure cancer from your laptop." The table erupted in polite laughter, the kind that's meant to show everyone's in on the joke except the person being discussed. I forced a smile and took another sip of wine. If they only knew that 3 months ago. Helix Core's latest algorithm had identified a breakthrough in early-stage pancreatic cancer detection that would save thousands of lives. But they didn't know, because I'd learned long ago that sharing my victories with this family was like casting pearls before swine. "Well," Mom said, clearly eager to change the subject away from my apparently insignificant career. "At least you're keeping busy. Though we do worry about you in that little apartment all by yourself." Little apartment. If only she knew that my little apartment was a penthouse overlooking the Cincinnati skyline, paid for in cash the day I closed my first major acquisition deal. But I nodded and played my part in their narrative. "I'm doing fine, Mom, really." The conversation moved on to safer topics: Christopher's daughter's piano recitals, Daniel's son's college applications, the upcoming renovation of the family lake house. I listened and responded at appropriate intervals, playing the role I'd been assigned the spinster daughter who'd never quite figured out how to be successful like her brothers. As the evening wore on, I couldn't help but notice how comfortable everyone seemed in their assumptions about me. It was almost fascinating, in a clinical way, to observe how completely they'd written me off. In their minds, I was the cautionary tale, the daughter who'd chosen career over family and ended up with neither. If only they knew that in my purse. My phone had been buzzing all evening with messages from my CFO about the Forbes interview that would be published tomorrow, but that revelation would have to wait. For now, I was content to let them enjoy their illusions of superiority just a little bit longer. The moment came just as Mom was serving her famous apple pie. The same recipe she'd been perfecting for decades and never failed to mention had won the county fair 3 years running. Dad cleared his throat in that particular way that meant he had something important to announce, and the table fell silent with the kind of anticipation that only comes when money is about to be discussed. "Well," he began, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate ceremony, "since we're all here together, I thought this would be the perfect time to discuss something that's been on my mind." He paused, surveying his kingdom, his wife, his sons, their families, and me, sitting at the far end like an afterthought, the future of Monroe Enterprises. Christopher and Daniel straightened in their chairs, suddenly alert. Sarah stopped cutting her pie mid-slice, and even Jennifer looked up from her phone. This was the conversation they'd all been waiting for, the one that would determine who inherited what when Dad finally decided to step down. "As you all know, I've spent 43 years building this company from the ground up," Dad continued, his voice taking on the gravitas he reserved for his most important speeches. "Monroe Construction has become one of the most respected names in Ohio, and our restaurant chain is expanding faster than I ever dreamed possible." He gestured toward Christopher first. "Christopher, you've proven yourself invaluable in running the construction side of things. The Riverside Mall project alone brought in $12 million in revenue this year." Christopher beamed, reaching over to squeeze Sarah's hand. Their twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, smiled politely, even though they were too young to understand the significance of what was happening. "And Daniel," Dad turned to his younger son, "your innovation with the restaurant expansion has been remarkable. The profit margins you've achieved are beyond what I hoped for when we first diversified." Daniel nodded, his chest puffing with pride. "Thank you, Dad. I've always believed in the potential of the hospitality sector." "Which is why," Dad announced, I've decided to divide the company between you two. Christopher will inherit Monroe Construction and all its associated assets, while Daniel will take over the restaurant chain and our real estate holdings. The announcement hit the table like a stone dropped in still water. Sarah actually gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Jennifer set down her fork with a satisfied clink. Even my nephew Matthew looked impressed, probably calculating how much his trust fund had just increased. "Dad, that's—" Christopher started, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You've earned it, son. Both of you have." I continued eating my pie, waiting for the inevitable. In the Monroe family, generosity toward some always came with calculated exclusion of others. "Now, Rachel." Dad's voice shifted, taking on the tone one might use when explaining to a child why they can't have a pony. "I know this might be disappointing, but I've always believed that each child should receive what they're equipped to handle." "Here it comes," I thought, maintaining my neutral expression while my family watched me like spectators at a gladiator match. "Your interests have always been different from your brother's, more academic, less practical." He said academic like it was a disease. "So I've set aside a sum that should help you continue your computer work without the pressures of running a real business." "How much?" The question came out before I could stop it, though I already knew it would be insulting. $40,000, Dad announced proudly, as if he was bestowing a kingdom upon me. "It's enough to keep you comfortable while you figure out what you really want to do with your life." The silence that followed was deafening. $40,000. Christopher and Daniel were inheriting companies worth millions, and I was getting what amounted to a year's salary for an entry-level position. "Dad," I said carefully, "that's very generous." Christopher couldn't contain himself. "Well, I think that's more than fair," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I mean, it's not like Rachel has the business experience to handle a real company anyway." "Exactly," Daniel chimed in, emboldened by his brother's support. "No offense, Rach, but sitting at a computer all day coding isn't exactly the same as managing employees and dealing with clients." Sarah nodded sagely. "Maybe you could use the money to take some business classes, learn some practical skills." "Or find a nice man to settle down with," Jennifer added with a laugh. $40,000 would make a lovely wedding fund." The laughter that erupted around the table was like acid in my ears. My own family, treating my life's work like a hobby I'd eventually outgrow, treating me like a charity case who needed their pity and guidance to function in the real world. "I appreciate everyone's concern," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "But I'm actually doing quite well with my computer work." "Oh, sweetheart." Mom reached over to pat my hand, her touch condescending. "We know you're trying your best, but $40,000 is a safety net. Something to fall back on when you're ready to be more realistic about your future." More realistic. As if building algorithms that could detect diseases years before symptoms appeared wasn't realistic. As if creating technology that was revolutionizing healthcare wasn't practical enough for the Monroe family standards. "Besides," Christopher added, cutting another bite of pie, "let's be honest, how much money can there really be in medical computers? It's not exactly a growth industry." Daniel laughed. "Remember when she tried to explain what she does at last year's dinner? Something about artificial intelligence. I still don't understand how you can make a living from something that doesn't even exist." "Artificial intelligence exists, Uncle Daniel." Matthew spoke up from across the table, the first words he'd said all evening. "It's actually pretty cool stuff." "Matthew, honey, eat your pie." Jennifer quickly silenced her son. "The adults are talking." I watched this exchange with growing fascination. Here was my family, discussing my future like I was an unfortunate relative who needed to be managed rather than a daughter and sister who deserved respect. The $40,000 wasn't a gift, it was a dismissal, a way to clear their consciences while ensuring I knew exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. "So it's settled then," Dad concluded, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast. "To the future of Monroe Enterprises." May it continue to prosper under capable leadership. The cups clinked together in celebration, and I raised mine as well, playing my part in their little drama. Let them have their moment of triumph, I thought. Let them bask in their certainty that they'd won. But as I sipped my coffee and watched their self-satisfied faces, I couldn't help but smile just a little, because in approximately 12 hours, Forbes would publish their annual billionaire list, and the Monroe family Christmas dinner of 2024 would become a night they'd never forget. The assault on my dignity wasn't finished, as if Dad's inheritance announcement hadn't been humiliating enough. My brothers seemed energized by the official confirmation of my second-class status in the family. The wine had loosened their tongues, and $40,000 had apparently bought them the right to dissect my life choices with surgical precision. "You know what Rachel really needs," Christopher said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who'd just inherited a construction empire. "A reality check. She's been living in this fantasy world for too long." "What kind of fantasy world?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious, as if I weren't sitting right there listening to every word. "This whole tech entrepreneur thing," Christopher made air quotes, his wedding ring catching the chandelier light. "I mean, come on. She's 36, single, living in some cramped apartment downtown, driving that ancient Honda. If her computer business was actually successful, wouldn't she have something to show for it?" Daniel nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. Look at us. I've got the house in Indian Hill, the BMW, Jennifer's Mercedes. We take real vacations to real places. When's the last time Rachel went anywhere that wasn't a business trip to some tech conference in a convention center?" "That's not fair," I said quietly, though I knew fairness had left this conversation long ago. "Isn't it, though?" Christopher pressed on. "Rachel, I'm saying this because I love you, but you're not getting any younger. Maybe it's time to consider that this whole computer thing isn't working out the way you hoped." Mom set down her coffee cup with a delicate clink. "Your brother has a point, dear. Mrs. Patterson's son works for that big computer company Microsoft, I think, and he's making very good money. Maybe you could apply there. Get a steady paycheck with benefits." "Microsoft," I repeated slowly. "You think I should apply to Microsoft?" Well, yes," Mom said brightly. "Something stable, something with a future. This startup nonsense is fine for young people, but at your age, you need security." The irony was so thick I could taste it. My startup nonsense had just acquired 3 pharmaceutical companies and was valued at more than Microsoft's entire healthcare division. But to my family, I was still the daughter who needed career advice from Mrs. Patterson. "Plus," Jennifer chimed in, finally joining the intervention, "you really should think about settling down. I have a cousin who's 42, never married, and now she's desperate. You don't want to end up like that." "Desperate how?" I asked, morbid curiosity getting the better of me. "Oh, well, she's dating men with children, men with ex-wives, men who are clearly just looking for someone to split the bills with," Jennifer explained with the authority of someone who'd married her college boyfriend and never questioned the arrangement. "If you wait much longer, all the good ones will be taken." "Maybe she could marry someone wealthy," Sarah suggested helpfully. "I mean, if the computer thing doesn't work out, that's always an option. There are plenty of successful men who'd appreciate a smart woman, even if she doesn't have money of her own." I felt my eye twitch. "So your advice is to find a rich husband?" "Not advice," Christopher corrected quickly. "Just options. You have to be practical. Rachel, Dad's being generous with the 40,000, but that's not going to last forever. You need a plan." "What kind of plan?" Daniel asked Sarah, as if I weren't capable of answering for myself. "Well, she could use the money to take some courses," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Business classes, maybe some marketing training. Learn some skills that translate to the real world." "Or," Christopher added, warming to the theme, "she could invest it, put it in something safe, let it grow while she figures out her next move." "40,000 could be a nice down payment on a small condo," Mom suggested. Somewhere modest but respectable, better than renting forever. I listened to them plan my life like I was a charity case they'd decided to adopt for the evening. Each suggestion was another nail in the coffin of their respect for me, another confirmation that they saw my entire adult existence as a series of poor decisions that needed their correction. "Yeah, you know what your problem is. Rachel," Daniel said, pointing his fork at me like a professor making a crucial point. "You never learned to compromise. You're so stubborn about this computer thing that you can't see the bigger picture." "What bigger picture is that?" "Family," he said simply. "Legacy. Christopher and I are building something that will last for generations. Our kids will inherit real value, real assets. What are you building? Code algorithms. You can't pass down software to your children." The condescension in his voice was breathtaking. "You can't have children if you never get married," Jennifer added helpfully. "And you can't get married if you spend all your time with computers instead of people." "I meet plenty of people," I said. "What kind of people?" Christopher asked skeptically. "Other computer programmers, guys who live in their parents' basements and think showering is optional." The table erupted in laughter again, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't just family ribbing anymore. This was systematic humiliation, a coordinated effort to make me understand exactly how little they thought of me and my choices. "Look," Christopher said, his tone becoming more serious. "We're not trying to be mean. We're trying to help you see reality. You're smart. Rachel, you could do well in a normal job with normal people making normal money. But this fantasy you're living thinking you're going to become some tech mogul, it's just not realistic." "Why isn't it realistic?" I asked. "Because," Daniel said with exaggerated patience, "real business takes capital, infrastructure, connections. You can't build a serious company from your apartment with a laptop and a dream." "Your uncle's right." Matthew spoke up suddenly, looking at me with the kind of pity usually reserved for wounded animals. "I mean, no offense, Aunt Rachel, but if your company was actually successful, wouldn't we have heard about it by now?" Out of the mouths of babes, my own nephew, a college student who probably spent more on coffee in a month than most people made in salary, was lecturing me about business success. "Maybe she should start smaller," Emma suggested. At 16, Christopher's daughter had apparently decided she was qualified to offer career guidance. Like, instead of trying to build a whole company, maybe just get a job at someone else's company first. "That's actually very mature thinking, sweetheart." Sarah beamed at her daughter, then turned to me. "See, even Emma understands the value of starting at the bottom and working your way up." I nodded slowly, swallowing the urge to laugh out loud. If only they knew that the someone else's company Emma was suggesting I work for would probably be one of the many smaller firms that Helix Core had quietly acquired over the past 2 years. The clock on the mantel chimed 9:15 p. And I realized I'd been enduring this character assassination for nearly 2 hours. But as I looked around the table at their earnest, concerned faces, faces that were so certain they were helping me see the light, I felt something shift inside me. Let them talk, I thought. Let them explain to me how the real world works, how business operates, how success is measured. In a few minutes, they were going to get a masterclass in all three. The intervention might have continued indefinitely if not for Matthew's phone buzzing insistently on the table beside his dessert plate. He'd been the only one not participating in the systematic demolition of my life choices. Instead, scrolling through what looked like social media with the bored expression of a 20-year-old forced to endure adult conversation. "Sorry," he mumbled, glancing at the screen. "Just checking if Forbes dropped their new list yet. Professor Martinez assigned us to analyze the billionaire rankings for our economics class." "So the what list?" Jennifer asked, momentarily distracted from planning my romantic future. "Forbes billionaire list," Matthew explained, his thumb moving across the screen. "They update it quarterly now instead of just annually. It's actually pretty interesting to see who moves up and down based on market fluctuations and—" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening as he stared at his phone. The casual expression on his face transformed into something between shock and confusion. He blinked hard, as if trying to clear his vision, then looked up at me with the strangest expression. He said slowly, his voice suddenly uncertain. Aunt Rachel. The table fell silent. Something in Matthew's tone had shifted the entire atmosphere of the room. Even Christopher stopped mid-gesture, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "What is it, honey?" Jennifer asked, reaching for his phone. "Did something happen?" Matthew pulled the device closer to his chest, his eyes still fixed on me. This is really weird, but there's someone on this list with the same name as you. Same name as who Dad asked impatiently. Aunt Rachel. Rachel Monroe. Matthew's voice was getting quieter, as if he was afraid of what he was about to say. It says here, Rachel Monroe, founder and CEO of Helix Core Technologies, net worth $4.2 billion. The silence that followed was absolute, not just quiet, absolutely silent, as if someone had pressed a mute button on the entire world. The grandfather clock had stopped ticking. The fire in the fireplace had stopped crackling. Even the background hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed to have ceased. I could see each family member processing Matthew's words at different speeds. Mom's face went completely blank, as if she'd forgotten how to form expressions. Dad's mouth actually fell open, which I'd never seen happen in my entire life. Christopher and Daniel looked like they'd been simultaneously slapped and told that gravity had stopped working. "That's impossible," Christopher said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It has to be someone else," Sarah added quickly. "There must be another Rachel Monroe." Matthew was still staring at me, and I could see him putting pieces together in real time. "It says she's 36 years old, from Cincinnati, Ohio, graduated from MIT with degrees in biomedical engineering and computer science." Another silence, this one somehow even more complete than the first. "Show me that phone," Dad demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades making problems disappear through sheer force of will. Matthew hesitated for a moment, then slid the device across the table. Dad grabbed it like it might explode, his reading glasses appearing from his shirt pocket with trembling fingers. The rest of the family leaned in, crowding around him as he read the screen. "Rachel Monroe," Dad read aloud, his voice growing fainter with each word. 36, Cincinnati, Ohio, founder and chief executive officer of Helix Core Technologies, a biomedical artificial intelligence company that has revolutionized early disease detection and treatment protocols. Recent acquisitions include Meridian Pharmaceuticals, Grayson Medical Research, and Blackwood Biotech. Estimated net worth $4.2 billion. The phone slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. Emma reached for it, but Sarah grabbed her wrist. "Don't," Sarah whispered. "Just don't." I could feel 8 pairs of eyes turning toward me like searchlights. The weight of their stares was almost physical, pressing down on me from all directions. For a moment, I considered maintaining the charade. I could laugh it off, claim it was a coincidence. Let them continue believing I was the family failure who needed their guidance and pity. But then I remembered Christopher's suggestion that I apply to Microsoft, Daniel's lecture about building something lasting, Jennifer's advice to find a rich husband, Mom's concern about my little apartment, Dad's generous gift of $40,000 to help me figure out what I really wanted to do with my life. "Well," I said finally, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "I guess the secret's out." The simplicity of my response seemed to hit them harder than any dramatic revelation could have. It was the casual tone that did it the way I said it, like I was admitting to forgetting to pick up milk at the store rather than confirming that I was worth more money than some small country's entire GDP. "You," Dad stuttered, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "You're a billionaire." I finished for him. "Yes, 4.2 billion, apparently, though the number fluctuates based on market conditions. Helix Core went public 18 months ago, and we've had some very successful quarters." Christopher's face had gone white. But you drive a Honda. A 2018 Honda Civic, I confirmed. Very reliable. Good gas mileage. I don't see the point in flashy cars when I spend most of my time in laboratories or boardrooms. Your apartment, Mom whispered. You said you lived in a small apartment. I said I lived downtown. You assumed it was small. It's actually the penthouse of the Meridian Tower, 42nd floor. Lovely view of the river. Daniel was shaking his head like he could make this information disappear through sheer denial. This doesn't make sense. We would have known. We would have heard about it. Well, why would you hear about it? I asked genuinely. You've never shown any interest in biomedical technology. You think artificial intelligence doesn't exist. Why would any of you be following developments in my industry? But the news, Jennifer said desperately. Local news. Business journals? Someone would have mentioned it. Oh, they have, I said calmly. Helix Core has been featured in the Wall Street Journal 6 times this year. Forbes did a cover story on our cancer detection breakthrough in September. Time magazine named me one of their people to watch in healthcare innovation. But you don't read those publications, so you wouldn't have seen it. The silence returned, but this time it felt different, heavier, charged with the electricity of a world being turned completely upside down. Matthew was the first to speak, his young voice cutting through the tension. Holy shit, he breathed. Aunt Rachel, you're actually famous. Matthew. Jennifer snapped automatically, but her heart wasn't in it. She was still staring at me like I'd just revealed I was actually an alien. Sorry, Matthew said, not looking sorry at all. But this is insane. Do you know what this means? Aunt Rachel is richer than Jeff Bezos? She's richer than Elon Musk. No, I corrected gently. I'm not quite in their league yet, but I'm working on it. The casual way I said yet seemed to break something fundamental in the room's atmosphere. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about everything they thought they knew about me, about themselves, about how the world worked. And we were just getting started. The questions came like machine gun fire once the initial shock wore off. Dad recovered first, his businessman instincts kicking in even as his worldview crumbled around him. How? He demanded, leaning forward in his chair. How is this possible? When did this happen? Why didn't you tell us? I set down my coffee cup with a deliberate calm. Which question would you like me to answer first? All of them, Christopher said, his voice tight with something between anger and disbelief. Start from the beginning. How did you? Well, when did I become successful? I asked. Or when did I become successful enough that you'd actually respect it? The barb hit its mark. Christopher flinched, but pressed on. You know what I mean. When did you start this company, Helix Core whatever? Helix Core Technologies, I corrected. I founded it 8 years ago. I was 28, working out of my apartment, the one you all thought was so pathetically small. I started with $15,000 I'd saved from my job at the Cleveland Clinic's research division. 15,000, Daniel scoffed. You can't build a billion-dollar company with $15,000. You can if you know what you're doing, I replied simply. The initial capital was just for equipment and licensing fees. The real value was in the intellectual property algorithms I'd been developing since graduate school for pattern recognition in medical imaging. Mom was shaking her head slowly, as if trying to wake up from a dream. But sweetheart, we never heard about any of this. You never mentioned starting a company. I did mention it, I said, my voice getting colder. 3 years ago, at Easter dinner, I told you I was working on something that could revolutionize cancer detection. Dad said it sounded like science fiction. Christopher suggested I focus on finding a real job instead of chasing pipe dreams. The memory hung in the air like smoke. I could see them trying to recall the conversation, trying to remember how they'd dismissed what had probably been my only attempt to share my achievements with them. That was different, Dad said weakly. You made it sound like research, academic stuff, not a real business. It was a real business, I said, with real revenue, real employees, and real impact. By that Easter, we'd already secured our first major contract with Johns Hopkins. We were processing medical images for 12 hospitals across 3 states. But you never acted like... Sarah started, then stopped. Like what? Like someone successful. I raised an eyebrow. How exactly should I have acted? You could have mentioned the money, Jennifer said, her voice sharp with accusation. You let us think you were struggling. When did I say I was struggling? I asked. When did I ever ask any of you for money or help or anything? Silence, because I hadn't ever. You drove that old car, Christopher said, grasping for something concrete to hold on to. I still drive that car. It's reliable, efficient, and it gets me where I need to go. Success doesn't require ostentation. But the apartment? Mom insisted. You always made it sound so modest. I live in a 3-bedroom penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the entire city, I said matter-of-factly. I never described it as modest. You assumed it was modest because you assumed I was unsuccessful. Daniel was gripping his wine glass so tightly I worried it might shatter. This doesn't make sense. If you're so successful, why didn't you correct us? Why let us think? Think what I asked. That I was a failure, that I needed your advice and guidance, that I was the cautionary tale in the Monroe family success story. That's not... He started, but I held up a hand. Let me explain how Helix Core works, I said, settling back in my chair like I was beginning a lecture. We've developed AI systems that can detect over 40 different types of cancer from standard medical imaging, often years before symptoms appear. Our algorithms have a 97% accuracy rate, which is higher than most specialist radiologists. I paused, watching their faces. The technical details were clearly going over their heads, but the implications were starting to sink in. 3 months ago, our system detected early-stage pancreatic cancer in a 45-year-old teacher from Toledo. Standard screening wouldn't have caught it for another 2 years, by which point it would have been terminal. Because of our technology, she's now in treatment and has a 90% chance of full recovery. That's... Mom's voice was barely a whisper. That's incredible. It's just Tuesday for us, I said simply. We save lives every day. That's what my computer work actually does. Matthew was staring at me with something approaching awe. How many people work for you? 837 employees across 4 countries. I said, we have research facilities in Cincinnati, Boston, Geneva, and Tokyo. Our Tokyo lab just developed a breakthrough in early Alzheimer's detection that we'll be announcing next month. Jesus Christ, Daniel breathed. 800 employees. Plus contractors and research partnerships with 17 universities. I added, we're currently funding 12 doctoral programs and have partnerships with every major medical school in North America. The scope of what I was describing was clearly overwhelming them. Christopher kept opening his mouth to speak, then closing it again, as if he couldn't find words adequate to the situation. The pharmaceutical acquisitions, Dad said suddenly. Matthew said you acquired pharmaceutical companies. 3 major ones, I confirmed. Meridian Pharmaceuticals was developing a promising Alzheimer's treatment that complemented our diagnostic technology. Grayson Medical Research had breakthrough work in personalized cancer therapies. Blackwood Biotech was pioneering genetic screening protocols. How much did those cost? Christopher asked, though he looked like he was afraid of the answer. The 3 acquisitions totaled $2.7 billion, I said casually. All cash purchases. Jennifer actually choked on her wine. $2.7 billion in cash. Helix Core's revenue last year was $8.4 billion. I explained. When you're saving lives at scale, the returns are quite substantial. Insurance companies pay significant premiums for early detection that prevents expensive late-stage treatments. The numbers were clearly beyond their comprehension. I could see them trying to process figures that had no real meaning in their experience. Monroe Enterprises, the company they'd just inherited and were so proud of, probably generated less revenue in a year than Helix Core made in a month. Why, Dad's voice was hollow, defeated. Why didn't you tell us? I looked around the table at their faces, confused, overwhelmed, and for the first time in my adult life, looking at me with something approaching respect. But it was too late for that now. Tell you what, exactly, I asked quietly. That while you were planning to give me $40,000 as charity, I was closing deals worth more than your entire company. That while you were worried about me finding a husband to support me, I was employing nearly 1,000 people and their families. The questions hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable, because the truth was, they hadn't wanted to know. They'd been comfortable with their version of me, the family failure who made their own success seem more impressive by comparison. But that comfortable fiction was about to get even more uncomfortable. The revelation about Helix Core's success was just the appetizer. I could see my family struggling to process the magnitude of what I'd built, but they hadn't yet grasped the full scope of the evening's surprises. Dad was still staring at Matthew's phone like it might suddenly display different information, while my brothers looked like they were trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "There's something else you should probably know," I said, my voice cutting through their stunned silence. Christopher looked up sharply, and I could see the fear in his eyes. After learning that his failure sister was worth $4 billion, he was clearly bracing for whatever other bombshells might be coming. "What else?" Dad asked warily. I reached into my purse and pulled out a leather portfolio I'd been carrying all evening. Inside were documents I'd hoped I wouldn't need to use, but given the evening's events, it seemed appropriate to clear the air completely. "Monroe Enterprises," I began, spreading the papers on the table between the dessert plates and coffee cups. "Your construction company and restaurant chain? The business you just divided between Christopher and Daniel." "What about it?" Daniel asked, though his voice suggested he already suspected this wasn't going to be good news for him. "I own it," I said simply. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. This wasn't shock or disbelief. This was the sound of a family's entire understanding of reality collapsing in real time. "That's impossible," Dad whispered. "Is it?" I asked, sliding the first document toward him. "This is the acquisition agreement, dated 14 months ago. Helix Core Technologies purchased Monroe Enterprises through a subsidiary called Meridian Holdings for $47 million. Dad's hands shook as he picked up the papers. But I would have known. Someone would have told me." "You were told," I said gently. "Your lawyers contacted you about the sale. You signed all the paperwork. The only thing you didn't know was who was actually buying the company." Christopher snatched the document from Dad's hands, his eyes scanning the pages frantically. "This says the buyer was Meridian Holdings, not Helix Core, not you." "Meridian Holdings is a subsidiary of Helix Core," I explained patiently. "We use it for real estate investments and strategic acquisitions outside our core business. Your company qualified as both." "But why?" Mom's voice was barely audible. "Why would you buy Dad's company?" "Several reasons," I said, pulling out another set of documents. "First, the real estate portfolio was undervalued. Your restaurant locations alone were worth more than you were asking for the entire business. Second, I needed the construction capabilities for our new research facility expansion." I slid another paper across the table. "This is the contract for Helix Core's new Cincinnati campus. 3 buildings, state-of-the-art laboratories, administrative offices. The project is worth $85 million, and it's being built by Monroe Construction." Daniel was reading over Christopher's shoulder, his face growing paler with each line. "You're saying we've been working for you for over a year?" "You've been working for Monroe Enterprises, just like always," I corrected. "The ownership change didn't affect day-to-day operations. Your salaries stayed the same. Your responsibilities stayed the same. The only difference is who receives the profits." "The profits," Dad repeated numbly. Which have increased substantially since the acquisition. I should mention," I added, "the Helix Core campus project alone will generate more revenue for Monroe Construction than you typically saw in 3 years. Plus," I've been able to leverage Helix Core's business relationships to secure additional contracts. I pulled out a tablet and showed them a spreadsheet. Monroe Construction's revenue has increased by 340% since the acquisition. The restaurant chain is up 220%, thanks to some strategic partnerships with medical conferences and pharmaceutical companies. Christopher was staring at the numbers like they were written in a foreign language. You've been managing our companies? I've been optimizing them, I said. Your business model was sound but limited. You were thinking locally when you could have been thinking nationally. My connections in the healthcare and technology sectors opened doors you never knew existed. Sarah leaned forward, her voice tight with confusion. But if you owned the companies, why didn't you tell us? Why let Dad talk about dividing them between Christopher and Daniel? Because I wanted to see what would happen, I said honestly. I was curious about how tonight would play out, whether any of you would show even a moment's consideration for including me in the family legacy. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. They all understood exactly what I meant. Rachel, Dad said slowly, you have to understand. We believed. You believed I was a failure, I finished for him. So you wrote me out of the family business, out of the inheritance, out of any meaningful role in the Monroe legacy. You never even considered that I might have something to contribute. Jennifer was shaking her head. But you never said anything. You never indicated that you wanted to be involved in the family business. I didn't want to be involved in your family business, I said. I wanted you to be involved in mine. But that never occurred to any of you, did it? The truth of that statement settled over the table like a heavy blanket. For years, they'd assumed the flow of success would always be from them to me, advice, guidance, charity. The possibility that I might be the successful one, the one with something to offer, had never entered their minds. So what happens now? Christopher asked, his voice hollow. Do we still have jobs? Of course you have jobs, I said. You're good at what you do. Monroe Construction is more profitable than it's ever been, and the restaurant chain is expanding into 3 new markets next year. Why would I disrupt something that's working? But the inheritance, Daniel said desperately. Dad said we were going to inherit the companies. I looked at Dad, who was staring down at his hands. That was an interesting announcement, I said. Dividing assets you don't actually own anymore. Though I suppose, technically, you could will me my own companies. The absurdity of the situation was finally starting to sink in. Dad had just dramatically announced that he was leaving his business empire to his sons, not knowing that his daughter had already owned it for over a year. I don't understand, Emma said suddenly. It was the first time Christopher's daughter had spoken since the evening began. If Aunt Rachel already owned everything, why didn't she just tell Grandpa? From the mouths of babes again, the 16-year-old had cut straight to the heart of the matter with the clarity that only comes from youth. That's an excellent question. Emma, I said, looking directly at her father. Why do you think I didn't tell him? Christopher opened his mouth, then closed it, because he knew the answer, and he knew it wouldn't reflect well on any of them. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that it felt like we were different people sitting around a different table. An hour ago, I had been the family charity case. Now, I was the family patriarch, whether they liked it or not. And I was just getting started. The silence stretched on until I could hear the ice settling in Dad's whiskey glass. Emma's question hung in the air like an accusation none of them wanted to face. Why hadn't I told them the answer was sitting right there at the table with us, in every dismissive comment, every piece of unsolicited advice, every moment they'd treated me like a cautionary tale instead of a daughter? You want to know why I didn't tell you? I asked. My voice quieter now, but carrying a weight that made everyone lean forward slightly. Let me paint you a picture of the last 8 years from my perspective. I folded my hands on the table, choosing my words carefully. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about truth. When I first started Helix Core, I was working 18-hour days in a converted bedroom, living on ramen noodles and coffee, pouring every penny I had into research and development. I was 28 years old, and I believed I was building something that could change the world. I paused, looking around the table at faces that were finally paying attention to me, really paying attention for perhaps the first time in my adult life. I came to Christmas dinner that first year excited to tell my family about this incredible breakthrough I'd made, an algorithm that could detect cellular abnormalities in medical scans with unprecedented accuracy. Do you remember what Dad said? Dad's face was ashen. I could see him trying to recall that conversation from 8 years ago. You said it sounded interesting as a hobby, I continued, but I should focus on finding a real job with a stable company. Mom suggested I consider teaching something safe and respectable for a woman my age. Mom's hand flew to her mouth. Rachel, I was just worried about your financial security. I know you were. And when I came back the next year and mentioned that my hobby had attracted interest from venture capitalists, Christopher suggested I be careful not to get scammed by people who prey on naive inventors. Christopher winced visibly. I was trying to protect you. And the year after that, when I said I was hiring my first employees, Daniel warned me about the dangers of getting in over my head with responsibilities I wasn't equipped to handle. I didn't want you to fail, Daniel said weakly. But here's the thing, I said, my voice growing stronger. I wasn't failing. I was succeeding beyond my wildest dreams. Every year, I achieved something remarkable. Every year, I came to these dinners hoping to share my victories with the people who were supposed to love me, and every year, you found new ways to diminish what I'd accomplished. The indictment was devastating in its simplicity. I could see them remembering those conversations now, seeing them through my eyes instead of their own assumptions. 3 years ago, when Helix Core went public and I became a millionaire overnight, I tried to tell you about it. Dad said the stock market was too volatile to count as real wealth, that I should be careful not to get too excited about paper profits. Dad's whiskey glass was trembling in his hand. I was trying to help you stay grounded. Last year, when we opened our first international facility, I mentioned the expansion to Mom. She said it sounded stressful and maybe I should consider scaling back before I burned myself out. Mom was crying now, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. I was worried about your health. And 6 months ago, when Helix Core was featured on the cover of Forbes for our cancer detection breakthrough, I brought a copy of the magazine to show you. Christopher barely glanced at it before saying that business magazines always exaggerate success stories to sell copies. The weight of years of dismissal, years of being treated like a child playing dress-up in the adult world of business, settled over the table like a fog. They were finally understanding what they'd done, not just ignoring my success, but actively working to undermine my confidence in it. So, you want to know why I didn't tell you I'd bought Monroe Enterprises? I asked, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Because every single time I tried to share my achievements with this family, you found ways to minimize them, question them, or dismiss them entirely. I stood up slowly, placing my napkin beside my plate with deliberate precision. You weren't interested in my success when it was happening. You were comfortable with your version of me, the daughter who couldn't quite figure out how to be successful like her brothers, the cautionary tale that made your own achievements seem more impressive by comparison. Sarah was staring down at her hands. Jennifer had gone completely pale. Even Matthew, who had sparked this entire revelation, looked uncomfortable as he began to understand the family dynamics he'd inadvertently exposed. You want to know what the real tragedy is? I continued, my voice growing colder with each word. It's not that you didn't believe in me. It's that you didn't want to believe in me. My failure was more valuable to you than my success could ever be. The accusation hit the table like a physical blow, because it was true, and we all knew it. Rachel, that's not, Christopher started. Isn't it? I cut him off. Tell me, Christopher, what was your first thought when Matthew read that Forbes article? Was it pride in your sister's accomplishment, or was it fear that your place in the family hierarchy had just been threatened? He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, because his first thought hadn't been pride. It had been shock, confusion, and yes, fear. Fear that everything he'd believed about his own importance had just been proven wrong. And you, Daniel, I turned to my other brother. When you realized I'd been employing you for over a year, what was your first emotion? Gratitude that I'd helped grow the family business, or humiliation that the sister you'd been giving career advice to was actually your boss? Daniel's face flushed red, but he didn't deny it. He couldn't deny it. The truth is, I said, looking around the table at each of them in turn, you needed me to be unsuccessful. You needed someone to look down on, someone to feel superior to, someone to give advice to. My failure validated your success. My struggles made your victories meaningful. I picked up my purse, the same modest black bag they'd probably judged as another sign of my lack of sophistication. But I was never a failure. I was never struggling. I was building something extraordinary while you were busy feeling sorry for me. And the saddest part is that if you'd actually paid attention, if you'd actually listened, you could have been part of something incredible instead of just inheriting the leftovers of someone else's vision. The clock chimed 10:15 p.m., and I realized this evening had lasted exactly as long as it needed to. 8 years of being dismissed, minimized, and patronized had led to this moment. Not revenge, exactly, but something more profound. Truth. Finally, complete and devastating truth. I don't need your inheritance, I said quietly. I don't need your approval. I don't need your business advice or your career guidance or your concerns about my future. What I needed was your respect, and you made it clear years ago that was never going to happen. The silence that followed felt final, like the end of something that could never be repaired, because some things, once said, cannot be unsaid. Some truths, once revealed, cannot be hidden again. And some families, once broken, cannot be put back together. I stood there for a moment, looking at each of them one final time. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the background, marking the seconds of what I knew would be our last family dinner as we'd always known it. The Monroe family Christmas tradition was ending tonight, not with celebration or reconciliation, but with the quiet devastation of truth finally spoken. "Rachel, please," Mom said, her voice breaking. "Don't leave like this. We can talk about this. We can—" Can what? I asked gently. Pretend the last 8 years didn't happen. Act like you didn't spend tonight planning my future because you assumed I was too incompetent to plan it myself. Dad finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "We love you. We've always loved you." "I know you do," I said, and I meant it. But love and respect are different things. You love the version of me that exists in your imagination, the daughter who needs your guidance, your protection, your charity. You've never loved the woman I actually am. I picked up the tablet that still displayed Monroe Enterprises' dramatically improved financial performance and slid it across the table to Christopher. "Your companies are in good hands," I said matter-of-factly. "I've tripled their value and expanded their market reach beyond anything you thought possible. Your jobs are secure, your salaries will continue to increase, and your children's futures are more secure than they were when you walked in here tonight." Christopher stared at the screen, his face a mixture of gratitude and humiliation. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me," I replied. "Thank the market forces that made the acquisition profitable. I'm a businesswoman, not a charity." The distinction was important. I hadn't saved their companies out of family loyalty. I'd improved them because that's what successful businesses do. The fact that it benefited them was incidental. "What happens now?" Daniel asked, his voice hollow. "With us, I mean, with the family." I considered the question seriously. "That depends on you," I said finally. "I'm not interested in revenge or punishment. I'm interested in respect. If you can learn to see me as I actually am rather than as you need me to be, then maybe we can build something new." "And if we can't?" Sarah asked quietly. "Then you'll have to get used to working for someone you don't understand," I said simply. "And I'll have to get used to having employees who happen to be related to me." The brutal honesty of it seemed to settle over the table like snow, cold, quiet, and covering everything in a way that changed the entire landscape. I walked around the table, stopping briefly to kiss Mom's cheek. She smelled like the same perfume she'd worn my entire life, and for a moment, I felt a sharp pang of loss for the relationship we could have had if they'd been capable of seeing me clearly. "Merry Christmas, Mom," I said softly. She caught my hand as I pulled away. "Will we see you next year?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just my mother, but a woman who was genuinely confused about how she'd gotten here. "If you want to see me," I said, "really see me, then yes. But if you want to see the version of me that makes you feel better about yourselves, then probably not." I turned to leave, then paused at Matthew, who had been silent through most of the evening's revelations. "For what it's worth," I told him, "your economics professor will probably be very interested in your analysis of tonight's Forbes list. You might want to write about the importance of questioning assumptions in business analysis." He nodded slowly, and I could see him already processing the evening's events through an academic lens. Good. Maybe his generation would be better at recognizing success when it didn't come wrapped in the package they expected. I walked to the foyer and retrieved my coat, the same simple black wool coat I'd worn to these dinners for years, the one they'd probably seen as another sign of my modest circumstances. I put it on slowly, giving them time to say something, anything, that might change the trajectory of this moment. But they didn't. They sat in their expensive dining room, surrounded by the evidence of their comfortable assumptions, and let me walk away. I opened the front door and stepped into the December night. The air was crisp and clean, and for the first time in hours, I could breathe deeply. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant. 3 pharmaceutical companies in Europe wanted to discuss acquisition terms, and my CFO needed to review the quarterly projections before tomorrow's board meeting. I smiled as I walked to my Honda Civic, the reliable car that had carried me through 8 years of building an empire while my family worried about my lack of success. Tomorrow, I would get back to the work of changing the world, one medical breakthrough at a time. But tonight, I had finally changed something much closer to home. I had changed the story of who Rachel Monroe was. And sometimes, changing a story is the most powerful thing you can do. I drove away from the Tudor mansion where I'd grown up, leaving behind not just a family dinner, but an entire version of myself that had never really existed anyway. The woman they'd tried to help was a fiction. The woman driving away was the reality they'd never bothered to discover. And for the first time in 8 years, I felt completely, authentically free. Thank you for listening to this story of truth, family dynamics, and the power of quiet success. I hope Rachel's journey resonated with you and perhaps made you think about the assumptions we make about the people closest to us. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story? Are you at home, commuting, or somewhere else entirely? Please leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts on Rachel's situation and whether you think the family can rebuild their relationship on a foundation of mutual respect. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your own thoughts about family expectations, success, and the courage it takes to define yourself on your own terms. Your engagement helps us continue creating stories that explore the complex realities of modern life. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply being exactly who you are, unapologetically and successfully,